Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. My dad will be so grateful. See you next time on the Mindful Fire podcast.
Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast, a show about crafting a life you love and making work optional, using the tools of mindfulness, envisioning, and financial independence. I'm your host, Adam Coelho, and I'm so glad you're here. Each episode of the Mindful Fire podcast explores these 3 tools through teachings, guided meditations, and inspiring interviews with people actually living them to craft a life they love. At its core, Mindful Fire is about creating more awareness and choice in your life. Mindfulness helps you develop self-awareness to know yourself better and what's most important to you by practicing a kind, curious awareness. Envisioning is all about choosing to think big about your life and putting the power of your predicting brain to work to create the life you dream of. And financial independence brings awareness and choice to your financial life, empowering you to make your vision a reality by getting your money sorted out and ultimately making work optional. And here's the best part. You don't have to wait until you reach financial independence to live out your vision. Mindful Fire is about using these tools to craft that life now on the path to financial independence and beyond. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start and download my free envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Let's jump into today's episode. Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast, Eric. It's great to have you.
Good to see you, brother. It's been a while.
It has. I'm excited to dive into a lot of topics today, but really exploring how taking a 3-month sabbatical allowed you to look inward and determine what direction you wanted to go with your life. But before we get into that, I'd love for you to just tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you're up to in the world.
Yeah, I'm Salvadorian. My parents immigrated to the States in the 80s. I was born in the United States, but of Salvadorian heritage, and grew up most of my life in Los Angeles. And then I moved to the East Coast to go to school. Thought I was going to go into politics. That was my jam. Everything related to social justice and all of that. So everything I was doing during college was revolving around that. Having impact that's scalable and positive around the world has always been where I anchor myself on. I moved to San Francisco thinking I was going to continue doing that. It was 2010 and we're coming out of a recession, and I was really seeing the sausage being made within politics. And I just realized that it wasn't the path for me. And then I saw what was going around in San Francisco and didn't really know much about Silicon Valley, but just felt like this was another way to have an impact, and jumped right into that scene. So I've been working in tech for the last 10 years or so. And the last big stint was at Google, 5 years, where I met you and your brother, and which was a great training ground for me. But eventually I decided to move on, and I'm now in Mexico as the VP of Revenue and Operations here at a fintech called Oyster Financial that is focused on providing financial tools and providing basically a financial platform for small businesses here in Mexico. So that is a little bit about me.
Very good. Thank you for the overview. One thing that stands out to me is you had that recognition early that you wanted to have a positive, scalable impact on the world. And it sounds like that really guided you in the early kind of exploration of politics, and then ultimately realizing, okay, maybe politics is not the path for me, but the tech industry might provide a good platform for me to do this. Can you talk a little bit more about how that guides you as you're making decisions and thinking about the direction for your life?
So I'd love to say that it's something that I'm constantly going back to. But what fascinated me about technology was that it was willing to push against the norms, push against what was already established, and maybe breaking some of the rules in order to make that impact, in order to make something big and scalable happen. And I just felt like that was something that going through politics and those traditional means, it wasn't going to happen. And I felt like it was not grounded on actually trying to make a difference. And so I keep going back to that because it was that interest, that thing that kind of, I want to try something else that kind of pushed me into time, because I feel like the first couple of years I was in rooms where I feel like I had no business being in, like in rooms. I started in venture capital, had no idea of what I was doing there. I just felt like I saw this room full of old white guys making decisions, writing checks. And I felt like at some point they were inventing the future, because the first sets of ideas get presented to these guys. And so they're the ones saying yay, nay, yay, nay, yay, nay. And I just felt like I want to be one of these guys. And so part of it was leaning into that curiosity and trusting that whatever I learned in politics, I can bring it into this field. I was a geography and government double major. So I didn't have anything related to economics under my belt, but I knew how to solve problems. I knew how to break down a bigger issue into smaller chunks. And maybe that's liberal arts education or what have you, but that's what allowed me to like take those initial first steps. And so the first couple of years in my career was really, all right, let's learn, let's be humble, and let's just get in the trenches. And that's really what one of my mentors encouraged me. You want to be one of these guys, you got to get in it. You're not going to just write checks. No one's just going to trust someone who has an opinion about a certain thing. You had to cut your teeth in it. And so for me, it was spending the first couple of years of my career learning and absorbing. And then eventually I got to a point in the startup that I was working at that it was working there for about 2.5 years. It was a sports startup. I'm not even a sports guy, but again, it was part of this kind of training ground that I put myself through, that eventually I realized that I was hitting the point. It was like, I'm learning, but I'm not in it all the way. And so decided to part ways. At that point, didn't even have a job lined up. Had a friend who had posted a job description for the team that we were in at Google. I just applied. Like, you know what? This is going to be a great opportunity for me to polish my interview skills. Still don't know really what I want to do, but I admire Google's philosophy and the scale that they do. You know, what an honor it would be if they were to, ask me to interview, because I just submitted my resume. And then it was like one interview after the next and after the next and after 7 interviews. And then they eventually asked me to join. And I decided to look at the time at Google as, okay, how to look at things at the grander scale of Google, and continuing to go back of like, all right, let's do something that matters. That's something that Google has anchored themselves on, do something that matters. And so that was the fuel for a lot of what I was doing during that time at Google. But eventually it got to a point where I was like, all right, how much am I going to continue to need to prove myself or learn or put myself through this boot camp? Because I wasn't doing what I wanted to do, even though I didn't have it defined. The day-to-day work wasn't fulfilling. It was challenging. I was surrounded by amazing, intelligent colleagues, but it wasn't filling me with a bunch of zest to come into the office. Perhaps it's the way I was looking at the work that I was doing. Perhaps there's also that. But there was also a separate part that I knew that I wasn't really coming back to that initial fire that led me to go into tech, or led me into social justice work way back when in my teenage years. So there was this internal tension that was saying that I wasn't being authentic to myself. And I started to recognize that tension. That, and on top of other personal things that were happening, it wasn't just professional, right? Like, you don't just decide to take a break from work just for professional reasons. At least it wasn't for me. I was dealing with depression, anxiety, all in the personal front. The professional part was actually the most stable part, but it was also like part of this general malaise that was underneath me. And so after months and months of dealing with it and realizing that I like hit sort of a rock bottom, I spent months, quote unquote, digging myself out of it through therapy, through journaling, through more healthy life choices, realized that I wasn't ready to jump into the next thing. Because at work, he's always like, all right, cool. You conquered this thing. Where are you off to next? And I knew that those conversations were going to happen with my director. And I was honest with myself. I was like, I can't push myself right now. I can't jump into this next thing 100%. There's something in me that's saying that I need to go inward and really just sit with what is it that was causing so much tension. I now had more tools through cognitive behavioral therapy and all of that. There's like, okay, I have the tools, let's go in. And so when I had that conversation with my director, it was more about, all right, so what do you want to do? And I said, I want to go to Mexico and play guitar and I want to compose music. I'm a musician as well. I didn't say that in the intro. Music's a big passion of mine. And it was something, I had a band in San Francisco where I played for 2 years, played in local shows. Everybody who knows me knows that's like a big thing that drives me. And so I was like, you know what? Let me lean into the emotional, spiritual side and less on the cerebral side and just do this thing. And luckily, my director was immediately supportive. I thought he's going to say, no, Eric, we cannot do that. I had all these negative narratives built up in my head, but I decided to just push through because there was something inside me that was saying, you have to do this. And even at the end, it's like, what's the worst that can happen? So when we had that conversation, that basically set a series of events that led me to where I'm at now.
That's really interesting. So ultimately, what you're talking about is that you took a 3-month sabbatical from your work at Google to go to Mexico, play guitar, focus your attention inward, and do some self-work to clear up where you're looking to go next instead of jumping right into the next thing.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very cool. One thing that stands out to me in what you just said is really that you wanted to do this. You felt like you needed this. And yet there was still a lot of doubt, a lot of story around they're going to say, no, this is not possible or whatever. It sounds like you had a lot of self-awareness around what you were going through and what you needed to heal, so to speak. How did you come to that awareness? And then having those doubts, going to that conversation with your director, how did you work through that?
I came to that awareness after years and years of work in therapy, in having to deal with internal demons that were coming out in a way that either I deal with them now or I continue to deal with this anxiety and depression that was over my head. When those issues were coming up, I recognized that there was a choice. There was a choice to deal with it. There's a choice to ignore them. And I chose to deal with them head on and having those honest, brutal conversations with myself about what was bothering me. It started with that. And so when I knew that these conversations were going to come up, there was just this voice in my head that was saying, you got to do this. And then there was a counter voice. It's going to be really expensive. You may lose your job. Like all of the negative scenarios. And the negative scenarios is something that's just constant. It's constant in all of us, but part of it is having grown up as a first generation Latino, born to immigrant parents. I was always aware that, okay, I don't necessarily have a safety net. Don't want to burden my parents with having to take care of me. So that was always that drive. And perhaps that drive was also led by fear, because that fear of failure, that fear of not having stability. And for a while, like that fear was great. And we all learned to internalize fear as a way to motivate us to act. But eventually gets to a point where we let it take way over. So when I let that fear go on overload and I realized, okay, I needed to dial it back. This fear is helpful. It's nice. It's allowed me to get to where I'm at. But this next stage of life, there's no way that I can continue to go on with it. And so then now aware of that, okay, who's talking right now? Who's talking in that other voice? Is it this curious, adventurous Eric? Or is it Eric that's being governed by fear? And so I learned to dial that voice down. It's okay, good point. Yeah, it's going to cost something, but how real is it that I'm going to lose my job? How real is it if I just ask that it'll go bad? And what's the worst that it'll happen? It's just taking that to its next logical conclusion. Okay, you ask, what if, what then? It was realizing, okay, it's not that bad. And so it came to that awareness through a lot of work, but then eventually it was something that I learned to dial back and not listen to, which was the fear.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like you really had to think through this, right? Bringing awareness, a kind awareness, mindfulness to the fact that, hey, oh, there's fear. There's this story about losing my job or not having the financial resources that I need to feel secure. It sounds like that's something that you had to turn towards and really explore to understand where it was coming from and then to be able to move through it. Because before, the fear was there, like we all feel, but when we're not aware of it, it runs us instead of us recognizing it and working with it. Is that something that you explored through journaling, or how did you do that reflection? Because that's something that a lot of people could benefit from. And not specifically only with this type of thing, but with any difficult emotions or situations that they're trying to work through.
Yeah, it was through journaling, and I'd gone through various forms of therapy. And the one that eventually hit at that point that was resonating with me was cognitive behavioral therapy. And a lot of it is your feelings are products of your thoughts. And so then if you can really go into your thoughts and really understand what's feeding those thoughts, then you can change and influence your feelings. It was a lot of talking through, okay, what happened in this moment that you're experiencing this panic or this anxiety. And so then talking it through and going through it, I'm afraid that this will happen. It's like, okay, already afraid is the core feeling. Okay, let's break that down. What are you afraid of? And then you just continue to break that down. It's not having stability, not having a career, abandoning a good job, being an embarrassment. There's so many things that I continue to list off. And so part of it was like, okay, then how real are those? And so you just go into that same feeling. And how real is that? How much of that is my own coloring and how much of that is reality? And then how much can I change that narrative in that moment to switch what it's doing, which was at that point was keeping me from taking a step, taking a risk. And that's really what techniques I applied at that point to get through recognizing that fear and going around it.
Got it. Very interesting. And so it sounds like once you're able to do that, you had the conversation. Sounds like it went pretty well. So tell me a little bit about, as you're looking towards this 3 months off that you negotiated, how are you thinking about using that time and approaching that time?
A lot of it was getting out of my head. I've always been very logically driven, perhaps to a fault, and not really recognizing my emotions and what the spirit needed. And I was always very skeptical on the spiritual side. I knew that there was something outside of like just logic and whatever is in the mind that I needed to go beyond that. Really, the planning was, it's a good question because another mentor asked me, was like, everybody was like celebrating and really excited about me doing this. But then she asked me, what are you most afraid of in this trip? And I had already gone over that hurdle. I was just like, yeah, it's going to be great. Go to Mexico, music, but it anchored me back. It didn't trigger fear, but it also reminded me there may be moments in these 3 months where I'm going to be doubtful of what I'm doing in the moment and maybe would want to run back. And so then I had a check-in session with myself. I was like, okay, why am I doing this? And what are the 3 pillars that I'm going to be anchoring myself on in this trip? And that said, it was play, connection, and healing. And so then at any moment in that trip, I'm not doing any of those 3, then come back to it. That was the most amount of planning that I did. I anchored myself on those strings. I didn't want to create an itinerary around it. I just wanted to set those intentions and I was going to go to this trip with that. And so even the 3 months, I said, I'm going to pick a city. I'm going to stay there for a week and I'm just going to trust that I'm going to find the next place to go to. And luckily, and it went well and it continued to snowball and continue to evolve. It's coming back to those 3 things. And there are moments where I was just trying to overcomplicate it. Maybe, I got to go sightsee this, got to practice my scales for another 2 hours. Didn't do it. And come back to those 3 things. And that became a great way to shape the sabbatical itself. It forced you to go against my natural instincts of trying to figure every little angle out, every possible scenario. No, I'm just going to lean into something uncertain because I want to let go of this thinking brain from overcomplicating things.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really like the simplicity of it. I really like the intentionality of it. You were thinking about how you wanted to feel. You wanted to feel healed. You wanted to feel playful. You wanted to feel connected. Those are all feelings. And you can tell in the moment, am I feeling this? Or am I caught up in some story? Or am I caught up in some planning? Honestly, this is one of the things that has kept me from trying to take some extended time off. One, it's the fear of all the stories and what bad things can happen. But it's also just the idea that, am I going to even use this time productively? Which already assumes that I should be using the time.
Why be productive?
Why? I'm about to take 3 weeks off coming up in a few weeks. And I'm already stressing out. Oh my God, I got to use this time really wisely. And I'm thinking back now to when I went on that rotation to Portugal in 2019. It was that feeling. I stressed myself out to no end, thinking I needed to make the most of the opportunity, whatever that even means. And you can get so caught up and miss the opportunity to just be and just relax into yourself a little bit more. It sounds like you were able to catch yourself doing that when you were doing that and come back to these 3 pillars. I'm interested to hear how everything went. It sounds like it was a pretty transformative time for you. So I'd love to hear more about what you learned about yourself and what came out of it.
Yeah, it was extremely transformative. The trip was shaped by leaning into those three feelings, those three pillars. And I didn't have any plan around it, but as I go back to it, things started to take shape and take form. And part of it was me leaning into that uncertainty even more. And what helped set the frame, even going into this trip, was this book that I was reading called The Artist's Way. And it was a book that a friend recommended to me on the flight that I was going to fly over to Mexico. She had just come out of a sabbatical. She's an entrepreneur. And I asked her, what helped you during this period? And she was like, read this book. I downloaded the first 2 chapters and read them on the plane. And I was like, this is the book. This is the book. And part of it, it's centered around this whole idea of we're all creative beings. And creation is not just something that a musician does or a painter does. We're all wanting to create. We're all wanting to take form and interpret the world and project that interpretation out to everybody and share that. And our true essence is to be creators, and our connection to the universe is really at its highest when we are creating, where we're allowing ourselves to create and not letting those negative voices say, you're not good, your work is worthless, things like that. And a lot of what that book has you do is deconstruct those thoughts. And it's anchored around 2 main things: journaling every day, 3 pages, free thought, basically just vomit out what's in your brain. And 3 pages is long enough for you to see thought patterns come out, and also for you to do something about it. And so even though I was journaling before, it was more on as an as needed basis. So this kind of gave me the discipline to at least start the day with this. And then each chapter is anchored on a week and a certain theme, and you begin unpacking. But a lot of the work is done on your morning pages, which these 3 pages are called, and did that kind of work. Those are also great moments to check in with myself. It's like, okay, what do I need? The first couple of days, I was just in my room and I was working on music, but I felt isolated. So I started to go out, started to explore, started to learn more about the country, learn about the city that I was in. I started in Guadalajara, and I was with a family that absolutely loved Mexican history. They had a bunch of art, artifacts, history books. Every other night turned into a history lesson on Mexico. And I just became more and more interested. And actually it was a great kind of on the ground field trip, because then it was just like, all right, we'll just learn about this thing. Let's go to this monument. And so the second part of this book are these artist dates. And basically these moments, these days, basically it's about a set of 2 to 3 hours every week where you just take your creative child out on a field trip. And it could be whatever. It could be going to the museum, even going to a mall. But part of it is nourishing that child. And so then I would use those artist dates to, again, go to a museum, check out an area that I didn't know about. And part of it is these are intentional moments where you're letting your creativity, your curiosity just shine. You're not taking anything for granted. You're being more intentional about what it is that you're processing. And what better way to do that when you're in a new place? You're just forced to do that. And as the trip continued to evolve, I realized a week is not enough. Let me check out this city for 2 more weeks. It was funny how much the universe conspired in my favor in that sense, because there were moments where I was feeling alone and I would get a text from our friend Sam, and he's, hey, why don't you go to a couch surfing meetup? And I was like, good point. Yeah. And so that moment, that moment when I was feeling a little low, I looked up couch surfing. Turns out there was a meetup that day, went to the meetup. In that meetup, I met someone who's going to travel the world and needed someone to house at their apartment for a couple of weeks. And he's, you want to stay for a couple more weeks? Great. I'm taking off in 2 days. You're more than welcome to stay at my place for free. I was like, great. I was consistently surprised of the positivity around me and the good outcomes that continue to come about. I left and went to Mexico City, met up with a friend, and went to Valle de Bravo. But all that movement, all of that was causing tension. It's not like I had a light backpack. I had basically a mini studio with me. I had my recording gear, I had my guitar, I had a microphone. So I wasn't staying at hostels. I needed some place where I can sit and work for a little bit. And I realized when I got to Oaxaca, this is the last time I'm going to move. There's a moment where I was forced to check in with myself. Are you here to travel, or is any location you're in a place for you to continue to do this work? Recognizing that feeling in that moment, at that point, I was about a month in, and I realized, you know what, I need to chill. I need to sit and let's see how this goes. And Oaxaca was the place where I just decided this is where I'm going to stay. It's a small town, culturally rich, known for its food, known for its art. It's the cultural heart of Mexico in many ways. And I started to make friends almost immediately on day one. Started going to write my morning pages at this cafe. made friends with folks there, and just, what are you doing there? You're always coming here journaling. It sounds like you're working. I was like, no, I'm doing this thing. And then that kind of led me to making awesome friends there. And there's no reason why I need to leave. This is great. I started taking vocal lessons there. So that first phase is setting the stage for what I was in. And then the second phase, like leaning in all the way. And then the third phase was more about, okay, let's see what fruits come out of this full leaning in. And that was that part in Oaxaca, about a month and a half in. And I went to a local party at one point, and it was like a local artist hangout, and I met this girl. She seemed awesome. Her name is Ashanti. She was visiting from Mexico City, and just asked her for a number. She was just coming here to visit a friend. And I said, we'll see what happens. Kind of just leading in, into that. Even that interaction continued to blossom. And it was like, this is great. This is great. Something's telling me I need to follow up. And we hung out for about a week. And then I said, this is not the last time I'm going to see you. And then we stayed in touch. Basically didn't stop talking since the day we met. That was happening, and my connection to and fondness for Mexico was starting to grow. And so then as we were continuing to talk, I also was like, how crazy would it be if we just continued to see each other even after the sabbatical was? Because I sense that there's something that's calling me here. I was ready to quit Google at that point. I was like, you know what? I can work at a coffee shop. I'm vibing so hard right now.
With Ashanti or with just the entire
both?
Everything. Everything was just vibing.
Everything was vibing.
Yeah.
And Ashanti
it's a beautiful thing.
Was the person that allowed me to anchor into that feeling of that vibe. Even meeting her was interesting because some of the things that I was experiencing through the journaling was all this connection to something higher, some energy. And I've been a skeptic most of my life. And something is just like, I'm tapping into something that I haven't tapped into before, but I hadn't really articulated it to someone. And Ashanti does a lot of work in consciousness. And so she was just like, tapping into it immediately, verbalizing, putting language to something that I had a hard time really articulating. There was obviously a physical connection, but there was definitely a mental, spiritual connection from the beginning. And so then that made things even more interesting. How crazy that I could be anywhere in the world, but I'm here meeting this person who is totally tapped into the experience that I'm having right now. And so my mind was consistently being blown away by it. And so meeting Ashanti was a key point in the trip. Yeah.
Very cool. That all sounds awesome. Vibing on all levels, her articulating what you were feeling without even really being able to fully articulate it yourself. So what happened next? Where'd we go from there?
Where do we go from there? So knowing that I was feeling this connection to her, to Mexico, I knew that I had a choice coming back to the States. It was like, what happens with this chapter? Is this just a chapter that closes once I come back and I go back to Google? Because I hadn't really thought about career stuff, but I knew that something was going to have to fundamentally change coming back. And so during that second half of the sabbatical, I was obviously staying connected to the community. And then I was in Oaxaca, but then I started to come visit Ashanti. I visited her 2 times more during the time that I was there. And every time I can just think, okay, maybe I don't need to just I abandon everything that I've spent my whole career learning. Perhaps there's another place where I can apply this. I started to learn more about the entrepreneurial community here, the startup community here, because I had no idea about what was going on here. And then I just continue to see that there's a lot of energy, a lot of money just starting to flow into innovation here in Mexico. And they needed talent from Silicon Valley, people who just understand how things are done, quote unquote. Still don't know what that means, but basically have been exposed to working in a fast growing company. And so then my last week in Mexico, I'm in Mexico City. I have a friend who's an investor introduced me to one of his portfolio companies, and I meet her. She's the CEO of this company called Glitzy. It's basically Uber for manicures, massages, basically in-home services for beauty. And she let me know about what was going on in Mexico. And then that meeting turned into, you've done this and that. Can you help me figure out how to organize my engineering team better? And then that led into a lunchtime consulting hour. I was like, hold on, there's something here. A lot of the work that I've done can actually be applied here. And so that kind of just obviously lit me up. And I was just like, okay, there's potential here. And then that confirmed there's something for me here if I choose to take it. And then in that week, I basically also asked Ashanti to be my girlfriend, knowing that I didn't want to do long distance, but I knew that long distance wasn't going to last that long. I didn't know how, but I knew that I was going to make it happen. And so then I come back to the States. And so then that closes the sabbatical, but I've come back with this energy, these sets of experiences. And I decided to just start looking on what this will look like, this transition to Mexico.
What's coming up for me is that so much clarity and so much, I would say, deep wisdom or deep knowing about yourself, self-awareness really came to light during this time. Is that fair?
Yeah. It's trusting in what I had to offer here in this universe.
Yeah.
I had something to offer.
I feel like a lot of people never take the time to slow down. Maybe they don't feel super aligned with their work, but it provides a good income or it provides stability, and we just keep going. I feel like we go to elementary school, then we go to middle school, then we go to high school, then we go to college, get a job, then we get married. It's just like one thing after another. And you mentioned earlier at the beginning that you could have just gone into that meeting with your director, said, hey, delivered on this project, got promoted or whatever. What's next? And then just jumped right into the next thing. And so I guess I'm wondering, it seems like this, taking this step back, taking this time to go inward, to have nothing planned beyond just trying to heal, play, and connect. What did that mean for your life? What impact did taking that time to find that clarity and that self-understanding mean for you?
It allowed me to wake up in some sense from just living a somewhat unconscious life of, sure, I'm getting on the bus to go to work, but not really being conscious about the decision and the choice to go to work and everything that's surrounded. So it forced me to make choices. It forced me to be intentional about every choice that I make, and that every choice can have a consequential impact. And now, obviously, not everything is going to be life-changing, but at least treating every decision, every moment that life presents you with the attention it deserves. And that trip was a constant reminder of that, because I can choose to not go out. I can choose to stay in. I can choose to go talk to that person. I can choose to be anxious in some ways. And so then it allowed me to really feel what it looks like to be the captain of your own life in some ways. And it's something that continues. I go back to that trip, and obviously now I have my own everyday down here in Mexico, but it's something that I come back to shake out of that mindlessness of wake up, go to work, do this, do that, do this. Of, again, like I said, treating every moment of life and cherishing every moment that life gives you with the attention it deserves.
What I'm taking away from this is just the importance of slowing down and creating some space for ourselves. We constantly, I'll just speak for myself. I've been working at Google 10 years. It's essentially my whole career. I had a startup before. Generally, my whole career has been at Google, and the pace at Google is extremely fast. There's just nonstop stuff. The expectations are extremely high and getting higher all the time. So to stop, even for 20 minutes to sit down and meditate, I feel gives me some space to allow my mind to settle. And so I can see more clearly, what is the story I'm telling myself? What do I really want? I spend a lot of time thinking, oh, if only this would happen, if only I could take a sabbatical, or if only I could be teaching mindfulness full time. I get caught up in this if only and fantasizing about something that is not even happening. And to some degree, envisioning the future you want is very valuable, but taking time to open up some space for me to really just tune into what I'm feeling, why I'm feeling it, what is important to me in this time in my life could be super helpful in helping me determine if I need to make any shifts or align my time and my energy with something that may already be available to me, but I might be overlooking it because I'm rushing so quickly in the day-to-day flow of things. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. It's flipping that if only to what if. Because if only you're leaning into your limits, and what if is you're leaning into the possibility that you're switching that to more positive. And we can choose to lean into that. The negative spiral only takes you so far. And so it's more leaning into that. What more positive framing can we put into the situation that you're living in now?
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. The if only kind of way I was thinking about it is really because of my current situation, I can't do this. Right. So it's like setting a limit on myself. But really, if I flip it and say, what if I could spend more time teaching mindfulness. Okay, maybe that opens up possibility. I really love this idea and concept of possibility. And it doesn't need to be anything fancy and concept. It's just our actions have consequences, as you said. And going up and having a conversation with somebody creates possibility. You can't even know all the possibility that it might create, and being intentional about that. I really like that reframing to what if, looking at the possibilities that exist. And also recognizing that in my current situation, working for Google, I have a lot of possibility. And instead of thinking about it as a limiting factor, which I know sounds ridiculous, but when you're in it for so long, it can feel like that. To reframe it to the possibility can be really empowering. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's funny how our mind can work. And you're in a place where you have infinite amount of resources, or more than most places, and yet you still feel limited. That could be taken outside of work, just your day to day, right? The very fact that we have running water, hot water, that we have food on our table, that is not limiting at all. So it's changing the framing that we approach life. Because if life feels limiting, then you're going to have a limited life. But if life feels something that is here to provide for you, and you treat it with gratitude, then you will be rewarded, or you'll live a much more rewarding life, leaning into that positivity as opposed to negativity. So what's in your mind will basically manifest outside.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get back to the life journey. You're back in the United States. Sabbatical's over. You're back at work at Google. Ashanti's waiting for you in Mexico. A life that you want to create is waiting for you in Mexico. What happens next?
2 days after I land, that same friend who introduced me to an entrepreneur in Mexico organized a conference for Latinx investors. I knew that he was going to have a panel on investing in Latin America. And I said, you know what? I'm a volunteer. See if he has space for volunteers. I just got back from Mexico and I still have a couple of days before I go back to Google. Let's do this. In that conference, basically just pour out everything that I had experienced into every 5-minute meeting that I just I want to go back. I'm coming back in 2 weeks. Can you introduce me to someone? Kind of with this enthusiasm, with this zest. Luckily, that didn't scare anybody. And they introduced. And so I decided that I was going to keep coming back, and Ashanti would come up to visit me as well. And in those trips back, I would make connections from these people that I met in that conference. So I knew I had this in my back pocket. I come back to Google and let them know that, how was it? Had an amazing experience. I got to go back. But I also recognize that I got a job, so don't worry. I'm not going to abandon my responsibilities. I know that I got to pick things up where I left them. Having high integrity to my work ethic and all of that allowed me to establish the credibility with the folks that I was working with. Is okay, Eric's not just going to run off and let this thing drop. That's why in the first place, that's what allowed them, gave them confidence that, all right, Eric's done a lot of good amount of work. It looks like you need to. Let's give him that. That also gave me the credibility to take the sabbatical. And then that also gave me the credibility and trust that it's like, yeah, I'm going to verbally say that I don't want to be in Mountain View anymore, but I'm still going to commit to doing the job that I was hired to do. And luckily we have an office in Mexico. So I started to see, okay, what opportunities are in the Mexico office, and started to explore a variety of different options. Now I came back to analysis paralysis. I can find a gig here in the Mexico City office. Looks like there's some opportunities. Maybe I would have to take a different role, but it brings me back to Mexico. And there's months of that, to the point where I was just like, well, maybe I don't need to leave just yet. I was getting comfortable back to the life that I left. And I had a friend who had called me out on it, who was like, what happened to the Eric that came back after sabbatical? Now you're saying that you have it good here, which is great, but that's not the attitude that you had when you came back. You're copping out. And it shook me because getting called out is never fun. I'm grateful to have had that accountability from a friend, even when I was asking for it, to remind me of what it is that I was after. And Ashanti was patient, and she's just, whatever brings Eric here and he's happy, I'm all about it. And so then I started to lean into these conversations that I was having outside, coming back to that anchor that brought me into technology in the first place, making a difference, making something, feeling that the work that I'm doing, having either an impact in an organization or impact socially. And looking at what was happening in the startup scene, also, this is more aligned with what I've set out to do since the beginning part of my career. And one of those investors introduced me to someone who was just starting to get their startup going. And a lot of my conversations with the people that I was meeting down here in Mexico were very open-ended. Have a good amount of experience in strategy, operations, sales, all this stuff. I'm here to learn what's out here. And This conversation was special in the sense that the CEO immediately saw that there's potential for us to work. And so it was not only just telling me about the ecosystem, but he started selling me on the opportunity with his company. I could see you doing this. I could see you doing that. And I was just like, this is going in a direction that I didn't anticipate, but let's lean into it. Now, this is in the early part of this exploration phase, but we stayed in touch. Every time I would come to Mexico, I was like, hey, Step Coffee, what's up? How's it going? How are things? And then now fast forward into like October, now I'm in the thick of this analysis paralysis. And Ashanti was also holding me accountable to us, like, just lean into it. What was the thing that brought you to Mexico in the first place? Don't lean into those thoughts and that say you're taking a step back, you're going to take a salary cut, all of these things. And are you really interested in coming? And I set a date for myself. By this date, if I don't have a decision, I don't have something in place, I'm just going to come and I'll figure it out when I get here. The moment that I made that decision to just commit to coming and knowing that perhaps the Google route wasn't going to be the most optimal for my career at that moment. A week later, I get a call from the CEO. Is, hey, we just closed our round of funding. I would love for you to join the team. Let's talk about what we could do to work together. I was like, all right, this is the moment. I didn't know anything about fintech, didn't really know about the space itself. But based on the conversations that we were having over these months, I knew that there was a need that I could fill, but it was really ambiguous. And so then the day before I met with him, I did this visualization exercise. Okay, what does looking in Mexico, working for Oyster, being here with Ashanti look like? And so one of the parts was I see myself as the VP of revenue operations. Didn't really know what that meant concretely, but I knew that it was a good way to bridge the work that I was doing at Google to what the startup needed. There were moments of fear of executive, like I wasn't an executive at Google. What audacity do I have to say like be an executive? If somebody says, you know what, this seems right. And so then the day after we meet, after some small talk, get down to business. And what do you see yourself doing? And I said, I see that we can establish order, create a better way to measure the business, have some more discipline on how is it that we're going to drive user growth. VP of revenue operations is what makes sense at this salary. He's like, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do it. I was like, just like that. I was like, I should have gone higher. I got what I asked for. I thought I was like, I'm going to go for the highest that I can get. I got what I asked for. From there, a couple of weeks left back in the States, and I packed my bags and moved to Mexico right before pandemic hit.
Good timing. That's awesome, man. Really happy to hear that it all worked out well for you. And one thing that you said there, I got what I asked for. And isn't that really what we've been talking about the whole time? If we don't take the time to think about what we want and ask for what we want, how are we going to get it? I used to say, you don't ask, you don't get. And it's what we've been talking about the whole time.
Yeah. There's no pain in asking, and that you deserve it. Leaning into more of that positivity, not that toxic positivity either, but more of having confidence in yourself and what you have to bring to the world. And so that it just makes it easy. Let me just ask.
Yeah. And also just more broadly, right? Getting back to that idea of possibility and intentionality. You ask the universe, you put out there, I want to be back in Mexico. I don't know how, I don't know when or what it's going to look like, but I want to be in Mexico. And then you set a date. You said, I'm going to do it by this date. It's just moving a little bit more in that direction, asking a little bit more clearly what you want and opening to the possibility of seeing that. That's the way that I'm taking this. And I've had a lot of instances in my life that were very much like that as well. So I know we only have a handful of minutes left. Is there anything that you want to explore?
This pandemic has continued to challenge me to continue to lean into these principles, but it's that leaning into the possibility, leaning into your inner creator self has more positive outcomes out there for you than negative in the grand scheme of things. And so those risks that you think are probably really high are probably not that big. And the worst outcome is least likely to materialize. When we size up all the possible outcomes, we all give them the same amount of weighting, the same amount of probability, which it isn't likely. And so flipping that and recognizing that, yeah, anything's possible, but the likelihood that this negative thing is probably less than the more positive. And so looking at those life decisions in that way and not overanalyzing it, just trusting what your inner intuition and listening to what that inner intuition has to say is probably going to pay out. And obviously taking that time to listen to yourself is utmost importance.
What have you learned about trusting yourself through this experience? Trusting that intuition, trusting your own knowing. What did you learn about trusting yourself through this experience?
Going back to the earlier point, is that the most negative outcome is least likely to happen. Then I have more to share, and people can gain from what I have to share more than me not speaking up, or more than me not making that decision. And so it's not trusting yourself could also be a cop out to not decide and to also just stay in limbo. And so then the more you trust yourself, the more likely it is that you're going to make a decision. And life is really all about decisions. And so it's more leaning into that. It's more about living your life in the most authentic way possible.
Yeah, totally. Is there any practical advice you could give for learning to trust yourself more? The reason I ask is because I'm doing this work all the time, trying to tap more into what it is that I know, what it is that I'm feeling. For a long time, it was always like looking outside of myself. When I had a startup, well, what's everyone doing? What are the best ways to market on social media? What's the advice out there, right? Instead of just tuning into what do I really want? What do I really care about and value? And that's a practice. There's so much noise around on Instagram and just everywhere that it's easy to look to others to try to figure out what we should do. And so what practical advice could somebody take to learn to trust themselves more?
Part of it is not being too hung up on what the outcome of that decision would be, and more about what do you have to learn from it. So then whatever comes out of it, whether your business goes well, whether a business deal goes wrong, you had something to learn from it. And that's really what we're all here to do. And so that if you take each of these moments that you're presented with, each of these decisions as learning opportunities and opportunities to stretch yourself and express your curiosity and express your potential and to learn about what it has to offer or how it could get better, you're more likely to lean into that decision versus not.
Very good. Let's switch gears now into what I call the Mindful Fire Final Four. The first question is, what piece of advice would you give Eric from before the sabbatical?
Don't overthink things. One, you can't predict the future, but you can listen to what it is that you need. And if that intuition is louder than you think, you're just going to sit and listen.
Very good. That's great. Don't overthink it. Really listen to what you need. That's important, right? I'm finding myself burnt out and not wanting to really acknowledge that I'm feeling burnt out. Listening to the fact I need some time off. Like I took Thursday and Friday off and I'm like, this is great. Like not having to think about cookies and privacy for a couple of days. Beautiful. The second question is, what piece of advice would you give to someone early on their path to financial independence?
Whoa, on their path on financial independence. I feel like I use some of that advice myself. Part of it is, I feel like it's so practical. It's clear out your debts, have as little debt as possible. Start saving the most amount and then invest the rest. To be honest, that's still an area that I need to continue to work on. Like thinking that long term requires a lot of work for me to sit down and really plan out. It's like, okay, I have these assets. How do I make them work for me? So even that, recognize what it is that you don't know and seek out those resources because it's out there. That's advice that I need to be giving myself because I honestly, that's something that I need to lean into more.
Yeah, it's one of those things that seems really big and scary and complicated. But like you said, the resources are out there and we can start to learn and take small actions that can make a huge difference, like getting rid of debt. If we're carrying credit card interest, we're going in reverse. And so clearing that out and saving as much as we can and investing that. And I don't know if you know this book. I've mentioned it on the podcast before. It's called The Simple Path to Wealth. Have you heard that book? Yeah, I'll link to it in the show notes as well. But it's by a guy named J.L. Collins. And it's essentially, he wrote a bunch of blog posts as like a letter to his daughter about how she should think about investing after a career in investing for many years. And it's super simple and for me was quite empowering, because for a long time I was just like, I'll figure that out. I'll figure that out eventually. But once I started to really finally get to the point where I'm like, I've been working for 5 years and I haven't done anything with this money. I need to at least understand it. And I just automated something. It made a huge difference. And the reason I'm where I am financially today is because I made those small decisions to just say, okay, take whatever I have to invest, divide it by 24 and just invest every month in the total US stock market, in total international stock market, keep it super simple. That made a huge difference for me.
Definitely taking that with me.
Yeah, happy to chat anytime about that. So the third question is, what piece of advice would you give to someone getting started with meditation or mindfulness?
It's not as complicated. It's not as spooky as it seems. It really is, at its essence, attention. And paying attention. And that's why you do the whole thing. You close your eyes, focus on your breath to quiet everything that's going on in your mind. That in and of itself that's really, it can go beyond, but really if you simplify it down to attention and recognizing your thoughts, and then from there, once you recognize your thoughts, you can choose which ones to acknowledge, which ones carry the weight. So it's attention and choice. And it's really just that.
Yeah. Those are the two words. I would say attention or awareness and choice, right? Attention and awareness are, two sides of the same coin. But really, when I'm talking about mindfulness and financial independence together, those are the two words that come to mind to me all the time: awareness and choice. And again, the whole story we've been talking about today is about awareness. What do I need? What do I want? What am I called to? And choosing. Right? What decision am I going to make? What choice am I going to make about going out or not going out, going to Mexico, asking for this time to heal and connect? So I appreciate that. The last question is, where can people find you online and connect with what you're up to? Whether that be your music or your social media, any of that.
Yeah. So I'm on Instagram. It's probably the most active, but I haven't been posting. But I'm going to start posting now. I needed to take a break. I'm on Instagram as Statdor, Stat in short for Statler and Waldorf, guys from the Muppets. And I'm on LinkedIn.
Sounds good. I'll get those links and get them linked up in the show notes.
Oh yeah, in my music.
Your music.
The band that I was in was called Slow Load. SLOWLODE. And I was a singer and guitarist there. It's on Spotify.
Eric, it's been a pleasure, my man. I really appreciate you sharing this. When we talked a couple months ago and we caught up, I was like, this is amazing. People need to hear this. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your experience.
Appreciate it, brother. Thanks for having me and sharing the space with me. I'm excited to share and see what folks take from it.
Excellent. And happy anniversary. It's worth mentioning that you're celebrating your 2-year anniversary with Ashanti. And so it's fair to say that the sabbatical went well and the move to Mexico has been going well. So congratulations.
Appreciate it, brother.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode of the Mindful Fire podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I invite you to hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this. This just lets the platforms know you're getting value from the episodes and you want to be here when I release additional content. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start and download my free envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time on the Mindful Fire podcast.